So we now come to the final period, the late Victorian era. And as you may have guessed from what was mentioned previously about the change in the mood, one main trend started to move away from social realism. The Gothic tradition did not mean to reflect on society, but sometimes maybe it did all the same. So yes, that's the first important trend, the Gothic tradition. It had subsided in early and mid-Victorian times, sinking to the level of cheap, penny dreadful fiction. The best example of which is James Malcolm Rymer and Beckett Prest's Varney the Vampire or The Feast of Blood. Well, judging from the title, I'm sure you understand how low it went. Yeah, kind of lurid, sort of, pulp fiction in a way. Yet it gradually resurfaced in the 1860s and reached new heights of quality. First to be mentioned is the Irish novelist Sheridan Le Fanu. Now, as you can judge from his name, he came from French descent. He must be credited with a great macabre mystery novel, Uncle Silas, and a fine collection of Gothic short stories entitled In a Glass Darkly, which contains his masterpiece, Carmilla. It's a novella featuring a wily seductress, Countess Karnstein, and she's actually a female lesbian vampire. Le Fanu also contributed to a new type of fiction, surging to prominence and public success in the late 60s, the so-called sensation novel. There is a link between the Gothic tradition and the sensation novel. Though the sensation novel does not involve the supernatural and uses realistic contemporary settings, it focuses on a melodramatic central mystery, to be fully cleared only in the end, of course, to keep the reader turning the pages. And the Gothic ingredient is reduced to a modern super villain, male or female, ready to rob, kidnap, and murder his or her victims using every possible technique. The reader, of course, is kept on edge and compelled, yes, to turn the pages as multiple points of view, ellipses, diaries, letters, and even fictional newspaper excerpts are used. This might have been a recipe for cheap thrillers, but two writers really created admirable fiction in this field. First, Wilkie Collins, a friend of Dickens, an all-round man of letters. He gave us The Woman in White and The Moonstone. Both are remarkable for the quality of writing and inventiveness. We even have in The Woman in White a female amateur detective battling a wicked Italian count who is fond of white mice. Also great is Mary Elizabeth Braddon, also known as Mrs. Braddon. She probably wrote too many of those sensation novels, but Lady Audley's Secret is a gem, with an unforgettable female evil mastermind and assassin. So again, if you want some entertainment, I strongly recommend Lady Audley's Secret. Far from being looked down upon, these productions were accepted by even greater men of letters who sometimes borrowed from them elements of atmosphere and suspense. After the mid-Victorian deluge of social realism, this was probably enjoyable. The best example of such recycling of sensation and Gothic elements is, of course, the portrait motive and the assassination of Basil Hallward in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, a masterpiece in its own right, but in which the Gothic element provides an essential contribution to the central metaphor of life and art being, well, twinned, entwined in the painting, precisely in that supernatural motive of the painting. Finally, the acme of this revival of Gothic was reached with Bram Stoker's international hit, Dracula. Bram Stoker was an Irish writer interested in the occult and in close friendship with Henry Irving, one of the greatest late Victorian actors and director of the Lyceum Theatre in London, who was possibly a model for some aspects of Dracula. Yet the theme of man from elsewhere suddenly invading and destroying the normal world on account of his wholly different moral standards is repetitive in his other novels. This idea of the powerful alien. But those novels never achieved the same popularity. Only perhaps The Lair of the White Worm is vaguely remembered today. Some of the new themes and devices added to the Gothic tradition are connected with the late Victorian trend I have to mention now, which is detective fiction, because very often victims tend to investigate the villain, the monster, the alien. They even sometimes band together to fight, as you have it in Dracula. And that's, of course, something that is going to be repeated in detective fiction. This idea of investigating evil and overcoming it with the sort of new counter-hero, sort of modern-day magician with scientific powers and intellectual powers instead of religious powers. Well, of course, detective fiction is a field of study in itself. Let's only mention the most obvious reference, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the immortal creator of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, whose first appearance in A Study in Scarlet, 1886, was so successful Conan Doyle became tired of supplying new adventures, and he decided to have Holmes and Professor Moriarty plunge to their depths together down the Reichenbach Falls in the story The Final Problem in 1893. Public outcry was such that Conan Doyle had to resurrect him in the good old classic The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1902. Interestingly enough, Conan Doyle, like many Victorians, spent part of his life researching spiritualism, turning tables, and paranormal phenomena. Another interesting trend, and like detective fiction, fueled by scientific progress, is science fiction, which also lurches towards the occult. For instance, with Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race, or Arthur Machen's, or Machen, as sometimes they pronounce it, The Great God Pan. Can also go towards social criticism. This was the case with H.G. Wells, whose socialist ideals often transpire in The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, or The War of the Worlds. Last, and typical of a century ending in hopes for massive changes, sadly to be inaugurated by the First World War, utopias flourished again. The two most famous ones are Samuel Butler's L1, anonymously published in 1872, and William Morris's News from Nowhere, 1890. Samuel Butler was a rare Victorian specimen of an iconoclast, whose posthumous The Way of All Flesh, 1903, delivered a scathing family satire of the whole era. In Air One, which is an anagram for nowhere, the hero describes his experience through a fictional country. In fact, it could be New Zealand, but a country where machines have acquired consciousness and they develop by natural selection. Different is William Morris's News from Nowhere. Morris was a second-generation pre-Raphaelite poet, painter, craftsman, and many other things, and we will mention him at length in the next lecture. However, let us say News from Nowhere describes an idyllic socialist England after a not too precisely defined but inevitable revolution, a sort of naive paradise where capitalism and industry have gone and an organic, you see, we're back to Ruskin there, organic semi-medieval society has been restored. Yes, this brings us back somehow to square one, i.e., Thomas Carlyle's Past and Present, the great essay of the 1840s. So somehow the century ended with this idea of, well, disliking the present when compared to the past and trying to find new ways, changes. But this time, change is not to be found by resurrecting the medieval past. It's somehow by projecting it, but onto a future dimension. So definitely the late Victorian era looks forward to the 20th century. Very often mistakenly, but at least with high hopes. And this idea that anyway, change was inevitable. Be you a socialist, be you a communist, be you a nationalist, be you a spiritualist even, there was this idea that change was coming. Yes, it came with the First World War, sadly. Now, moving on to film and TV references, well, contrary to other periods, we have here so much material, so much quality material, so I can only provide a very limited selection. In terms of documentaries, well, I would recommend two. The Age of the Do-Gooders. This is mainly about socio-economic history and the history of values. The Victorians, their story in pictures. This is about art, especially the visual arts. On the monarch herself, we have a few films like The Young Victoria, not bad at all. And there's the Victoria TV series, fairly recent, definitely recent, and actually, I would say reliable in historical terms. There's plenty of things that have nothing to do with history or literature in it, but the elements that are provided are solid, I think. Very good documentary about Prince Albert himself. Channel 4, 2019, Prince Albert, a Victorian hero revealed. Interesting one. Individual authors and their works. Oh, well, ever so many. The Bronte sisters. There is a documentary called To Walk Invisible, The Bronte Sisters. It's really harrowing at times, very hard. Films. Oh, Jane Eyre. I think the 1943 version is still the best version. In it, I think you'll spot a very young Elizabeth Taylor. Wuthering Heights, same story. This one is full of defects, but others are worse, I would say. The William Wyler film, 1939. Dickens, oh, excellent film by Ralph Fiennes, the actor who turned director here. This is about the private life of Charles Dickens, and it's very, very good. Oliver Twist, I like the two versions, the David Lean version, the absolute classic, of course, and Polanski's version is not bad at all. TV adaptations, oh well, very, very good ones. Our Mutual Friend, Bleak House, Little Dorrit. Same story for Thackeray, Eliot, Mrs. Gaskell, and Trollope. I could have added many more, but okay. The basic must-reads, well, I'm sure you've understood where my preferences lay, and they are reflected here, of course. North and South, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Oliver Twist, some selected writings from Ruskin, Culture and Anarchy by Arnold, The Woman in White, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Dracula, and possibly News from Nowhere.